freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. New York, New York. There are no plaques on Market Street. No monuments, no statues, no service stating slaves once stood, worked, lived, and died here. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. There are no plaques on Market Street. Like Berlin's Germany memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, with some perceived imperfections, though a step in the right direction, a reckoning of sorts. Not to blame, but one that acknowledges a dark stain, a moment of shame. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. There are no plaques on Market Street. Where maid abandoned servants were bought and sold here, or the slave took the board after 1799 became partially free here. There was bondage here. Yes. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. There are no plaques on Market Street telling the narrative of abolitionists like Samuel Ringgold Ward, a teacher at the first Lancastrian school dedicated to the education of blacks, 189 Church Street, Poughkeepsie, New York, the colored Lancastrian school. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. There are no plaques on Market Street. All right. Yes. Nothing to touch, allowing the evocation of spirits, the echoes of souls, blacks and Quakers who were murdered here, who rallied here, in the name of freedom here. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Run off to freedom. Run off to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. There are no plaques on Market Street.
For those who led us away captive, asked us for a song, and our oppressors called for us. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?
If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand be still, and let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember thee, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy.
Remember the days of Jerusalem, O Lord, against the people of Eden, who said, down with it, even to the ground.
O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy be the ones that paid you back for what you've done to us.
Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock.
They say time heals all wounds. Now sometimes, yes, sometimes that seems to be the truth. Look at me, for example. To you today, I look like an average clergyman, a priest in the Episcopal Diocese in New York. Say my name, the Reverend Peter Williams, and it sounds just like any other priest. Could just as well be the Reverend John McVicker or the Reverend Samuel Seabury. But to the people of my time, I was a Negro who thought too highly of himself, who did not know his place, a Negro who would not keep quiet and who was therefore a threat. After all, my time was the early 1800s, a time in which 42% of all New York City whites owned enslaved people, and enslaved people worked the plantations all up and down the Hudson. I pray that there's been some healing since my time. But time hasn't healed all, has it? This graveyard, you see, is a place in which the sins of our past were meant to be buried. In particular, the sin of slavery in New York. This graveyard will meet some people who are directly affected by slavery. Enslaved people, they're enslavers, abolitionists, and apologists. They all come from a certain era of New York in which slavery was on its way out, or it shouldn't be. A time in which the Bill of Liberty was beginning to peel all across the land. But to some people, including some of us born free, it sounded more like a funeral toll. That bell tolls to this day because the stain of slavery has yet to be lifted. Time hasn't done it. This is our lament. We lament a time in which neighbor presumed to own neighbor. We lament that any child of God could ever possibly imagine that this was the will of God. We lament that time hasn't healed. It's only made far too many forget. And if we forget how we've treated one another, we can never repent. We can't bridge the breach between us. We can't repair the damage which continues to have some of us be slaves in your time as they were in ours. If we forget, we can never heal. Listen to our stories then, and lament.
Samuel Seabury, rector of the Church of the Annunciation, editor of the Churchman, professor at the General Theological Seminary, grandson of the first bishop in the Episcopal Church.
Thank you for that introduction. A rather impressive resume, is it not?
I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. Isaiah 13:11.
They pour out their arrogant words. All the evildoers boast.
Psalm 94:4.
That's hardly fair.
How's about this? Samuel Seabury, slavery's biggest apologist.
You say that like it's a bad thing. My dear Pastor Williams, have you learned nothing in all this time?
Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Exodus 21:6.
For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery.
Galatians 5:1.
That is rank misrepresentation of the basest kind.
Perhaps I should leave you then to explain yourself to these good people.
To these? Well, as you know, my name is Samuel Seabury, and I am the grandson of Bishop Samuel Seabury, the first Episcopal bishop. And I have made it my life's mission to right the wrongs of those who would, in fact, who did dismantle that holy institution known in our land as slavery. Now, I do not act from some base self-interest. I myself never had the need for the services of a slave. In fact, by the time I reached my maturity, slavery was in the wane in New York. The work of those sanctimonious abolitionists, the good Pastor Williams not the least among them. Oh, how those abolitionists disrupted society's peace and brought into question the rights of the rightful slave owners. What good Christian could stand idly by and not say a word to such abuse? Not I, no more than I could allow a woman to preach the gospel. Now, I do not act out of some position of ignorance. Raised as a devout Christian on the lap of my grandfather, Samuel Seabury, I studied the faith in depth, was graduated from the General Theological Seminary, and was ordained to the priesthood in 1828. the year in which slavery ended in New York State for all intents and purposes, although there were a few slaves around here and there for another 20 years. During that time, I entered the churchman and was rector of the Church of the Annunciation in New York City. As editor, I penned many a fine article on slavery and gathered them all together in a grand volume in 1861 called American Slavery Justified. Now, my arguments, again, little good to me personally, were logical and biblical. First, I proved that bondage is a holy estate sanctioned at the creation when Eve was created to serve Adam.
Since the bondage of woman to man existed in paradise, bondage is a natural relation. And since that relation may be abused, and since only that which is perverted may be good, bondage is fundamentally a good relation.
Next, I showed that the slave desired to be enslaved.
Slavery is indeed founded upon the express or tacit consent of the slaves. Otherwise, there would be insurrections.
Well, there were a few minor slave revolts now and again, but they were quickly crushed.
And since the relation is founded upon the consent of the slave, that relationship must be agreeable, and the foundation of the master's right must, therefore, be valid.
So, it was obvious that the white man carried the obligation to lead the African.
We may assume the charge and custody of the African race with humble, reverent, and grateful conviction that in so doing we are working together with God for the accomplishment of his wise purpose.
Yes, well, would those do-gooders stop? No, they insisted that the book of Leviticus demands that we observe the Jubilee year, that year in which the slaves are freed after 7 years of service. Such a naive and dishonest misrepresentation of Scripture. It should be clear why such a Jubilee is not possible.
The fact that a Negro can look forward to no year of Jubilee, such as was the hope of the Hebrews, is explained as being due not to the fact that he is a slave, but to the fact that he is an alien for whom the government of the United States was not intended.
And so, my dear friends, there you have it. If the strength of my arguments failed to stop the dismantling of slavery or that dreadful and useless war, it did not stop me from being made a professor at the General Theological Seminary in biblical learning. There from 1862 until 73 rather, at my death, I taught generations of young clergy in the ways of our Lord. Well, I hope I have illuminated for you the mind and the wisdom of the Episcopal Church in its defense of American slavery. If you continue to listen to the likes of Peter Williams, well, I have done all that I could.
All that you could?
Phoebe Mott, enslaved woman, free woman, mother, wife.
I was one of the lucky ones.
Well, you see, she says she was fortunate.
Lucky? I haven't been born into slavery, that is.
Well,
Oh, my life could have been worse like others I knew. Lot would beat me nearly every day for not working hard enough. Lot had their husbands, children, wives ripped away from them, all thanks to those who did what they could.
well, I don't have to listen to this.
No, you don't. That's your privilege. Never mind that now. As they said, my name is Phoebe Mott. Mott. That's the name I got when I married Caesar. Before that, I was just Phoebe. Sometimes I was Phoebe Livingston, and sometimes I was Phoebe Delancey, because those were the names of the men who owned me. You see, I was born in New York City. In 1782 or thereabouts, since nobody paid too close attention to how slave children were born in those days. And this was in the household of H.G. Livingston. And all I can say about that childhood was no joy. As soon as I could walk, that family had me running errands and cleaning and doing all manner of work. Those Livingstons were a strange family. Lived up and down the river, no two alike. One was governor of New Jersey, another a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Some of those Livingstons were members of the Manumission Society, while others were unrepentant slave owners. One, Philip, he even owned a slave ship. But H.G. was a hard man. He liked to let his slaves know who was boss. One time, a young man ran away, and I was 14 at the time, and when he caught him, H.G. beat him with no mercy. He used a whip and a rod. Made us all watch as a lesson. The screams, they haunt me still. That's why I thought myself lucky. When Mr. John Delancey come around 2 years later, one hot August day, he looked me over, and then he asked, "How much?" And old H.G. said, 60. They shook hands. They signed some papers, told me to get into Mr. Delancey's wagon, and we headed up to my mansion, and I was sad because I knew I would never see my mama again. But like I said, they sold slave children away from their families all the time, and I was 16. I had my mama longer than most. Besides, this new master couldn't be worse than the old one. And for the most part, Mr. Delancey was better. He held 9 of us as slaves. There was Ned and Simon and Peg and Tom and Peter and Hannah. Those were the 2 old slaves, and their boys, Abraham and Sam. and I was lucky. I wasn't there when Simon ran away. That happened about a year before I got there. And Simon never talked about what Mr. Delancey did to him when he caught him, but he wasn't beaten or hanged, so that's something. Simon don't give up too easily, though. 1809, he run off again, and this time, he couldn't find him. Most said he made it all the way up to Canada, and I hope he did. But mostly I was lucky because Caesar might come around doing work for Mr. Delancey. Caesar was African like me, but he was free. And I guess I caught his eye. He started doing more work for Mr. Delancey just so he could be around me. We got so close, he asked Mr. Delancey if we could get married. Now, Mr. Delancey, he's a religious man. He attended that church over in Ryan Christ Church. So he said we should go. So we did, and when he said we would get married, it was Reverend Haskell who did. Didn't mean I was free. Neither was our baby Daniel when he was born in 1801, but that year was important. They had a new law that said all children born to slaves like me would be free. That was in 1799. All I had to do was work until for like 28 years. The next couple of years, things happened quickly. The Quakers from the New York Manumission Society come around. Now, the folks in Hudson Valley didn't like them too much. Thought them to be a bunch of do-gooders. But they did convince some slave owners to set their slaves free. Or as in my case, allow Caesar to buy my freedom. And I'll be fair. Mr. Delancey didn't ask asked nearly as much from me as he could have, and nothing for our baby Daniel, but the poor Nan wasn't so lucky. She and her baby were sold the very next year. And I'm striving to make it my home.
She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Lamentations for her.
Well, anyway, as soon as I was manumitted, we went down to the Manumission Society to register me and Daniel as free Americans. Registering was important because bounty hunters like to kidnap Africans and sell them down south. Registering, it helped. It didn't always help, but it did save quite a few Africans. So, like I said, I was lucky. A lot of Africans didn't have the chances I had. Most had to work until they were too old, or until their enslaver died. I tell you, there never was an enslaver who wasn't first looking out for his own interests.
There was a good man, a Christian man.
Eliza Bart McVicker, daughter of Dr. Samuel Bart, wife of the Reverend John McVicker, mother of 6, wealthy woman of the time.
Your father owned slaves.
A few, but
He set them free
in his will, yes.
after he died.
Yes.
Then they also will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked, or sick or in prison, and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.
Matthew 25, 44, 45.
Please don't. It was not that simple. Nothing was simple. It was all so confusing. Yes, my father owned slaves. Never more than 8. I know that as I grew up, I had no idea what a slave was. They were simply a part of the family who did certain things while other family members did different things. That's how I saw it as a small child. But when she said enslaver, that sounded so harsh, so wrong. But my father and my mother, though, she had nothing to do with it. He was a good man, a great man who did great things for his community and for his country and for God.
Why, did you know that he founded Columbia School of Medicine and New York Hospital and saved George Washington's life? And he founded the church that my husband would serve as first rector. So he owned a few slaves. Well, I never did. Not as an adult. My husband, though he too came from a slave-owning family, he did not believe in it. And my father, he didn't buy all those slaves. Most of them he inherited. But he was good to his people. They called them the Barred Negroes, and they had their own little community along the Hudson. I remember them very, very well. There was Richard and Nancy and Pompey. Richard was only 4 years older than me. He was like an older brother, which was nice because most of my brothers and sisters had died of scarlet fever when I was but a babe. I was born in the waning days of the War of Independence. While Father had his medical practice in New York, we stayed up in Dutchess County for safety and comfort. I do not know, however, if it was right or wrong, slavery. It always confused me. My mother said that was the realm of men, and it was theirs to decide. When I met my husband John, he was studying for the ministry at the time. He and my father had many spirited debates about the rightness of slavery, but they loved each other and got along wonderfully. I could never understand why those who disagreed could not get along. Anyway, John and I chose not to own slaves. John even opened up a school for the black people of Hyde Park. When he took a teaching position at Columbia College, the school closed. As a professor of moral philosophy, of course he could not discuss slavery. How could he? Though, clever man that he was, did argue in the economics classes that he taught that slavery was unfeasible and led to unhappiness on all sides. I believe he felt it useless to scream about morality. That only inflamed the apologists. Could I have done more? Well, I had 6 children, and I believe I mentioned no slaves. Add that to the duties of a professor's wife and of higher classes. There were social obligations, you know. How could I spare even a moment for that sort of political argument, which was unseemly for a woman? Certainly a woman of my standing and responsibility. I am happy to say, though, that when my parents died in 1821, their deaths separated by just a day, the execution of their will was left to my brother William, who consulted John and me, of course. We made sure that all the slaves were freed and that each had a home. We gave them a piece of land all their own where they built a little community. Richard even worked for the church that my father built as its sexton until his dying day. He and Father are buried within sight of each other because my father was a good man.
That does kind of beg the question, what is a good man?
Richard Jenkins, formerly enslaved by Dr. Samuel Bard, sexton of St. James Episcopal Church, husband of Nancy, father of 7.
Richard, tell them what a good man my father was.
Well, Eliza, I already said, it depends on what you call good.
Eliza, since when have you ever called me anything besides Miss Bard or Mrs. Vicker?
Yet you freely call me Richard. Are we not equal in the eyes of the Lord?
Of course.
Well, Eliza, I've always liked you, but please, do not make me tell your father's story. I'm here to tell my story. Now, you may not like what I have to say, but you can stay and listen if you like.
I just can't.
I'm so pleased to make your acquaintance. Like Eliza said, my name is Richard. Richard Jenkins, and I was born somewhere around 1783. Breathe in that air. Church air, I call it. And I ought to know. You see, I was a sexton. But before that, I was enslaved. Enslaved by Eliza's father, Dr. Samuel Bard. Now, you might have heard of him. George Washington's personal physician. founder of New York Hospital and New York Medical School. Oh, and founder of St. James Church in Hyde Park, New York. Now, according to society, Dr. Bard was considered to be a great man. And he was also a kind master, especially compared to some of those brutal plantation owners up and down the Hudson River. But still, he doesn't give anyone the right to claim ownership of another man. So given my druthers, I'd rather have been free. I told him that one day. You see, the Quakers came by to see if a slave boy named Pompey was being held longer than the law allowed. In 1799, children who were born were just starting to get old enough to be free. So Dr. Bard called Pompey in and told him to go and talk to the men. And then he left and said that those abolitionists were fools. That's when I said, mighty fine thing though, freedom. He came up to me. Richard, Bard Negroes live a good life, don't they? That's when I said, begging your pardon, Dr. Bard, but if slavery is so wonderful, how about we switch places so you can get a try? He just laughed and walked away. I guess I was lucky he didn't beat me for insubordination. When I was younger, Dr. Bard got it in his head to build a church. Some say it had something to do with his son-in-law who was studying to be a rector, but who became the first priest. But who am I to judge? Anyway, I helped build that church. Me and some other men, they called Bard Negroes. It had been a couple of years when Dr. Bard came to me and said he wanted me to be the sexton. You know, clean the place, stoke the wood stoves, ring the bell, dig the graves, that sort of thing. I had been at it for a while when Dr. Bard died and granted me my freedom in his will. I was 38 years old. 6 years later, slavery had officially ended in New York. I half suspected his children freed me because I was starting to get a little older, and they probably saw me more as a burden than as a help. I don't know. It doesn't matter. All I know is those 6 years were precious to me and my family. And all my children were born free. Well, after I was free, I wondered what I would do for a living. But the congregation kept me on, and they paid me a regular salary. I worked there a total of 42 years, and not just me. My wife, Nancy, she laundered the linens. I got confirmed there in 1829. They even gave our family our very own pew. Of course, it was in the back of the church. Now, like I said, we weren't the only enslaved Africans in Hyde Park. At first, we lived in little cabins on Dr. Bard's land, right next to the Hudson. It's a national park these days. Well, after we were freed, we could no longer live there. So the Bard family donated a plot of land to a community of Africans called the Guinea Community. It's a national park these days, too. My life ended pretty well for a black man in New York in the 19th century. But I tell you, my life could have been different. I wish I had been born free. I wish I didn't have to live in a separate section of town or sit in the back of the church. Now, I don't blame Dr. Bard or any of the others. I mean, after all, we're all brothers in Christ. But I tell you, my life, it could have been different. It could have been different.
And I wish it hadn't.
William J. Lawyer, son of Supreme Court Chief Justice John J., co-founder of the American Bible Society, abolitionist.
Many of us, wish it had been different. Not too many white men, however.
It's a burden on my soul.
You seem like a pretty good man.
That means very much to me, sir.
Then why, may I ask, do you seem so down?
Guilt.
Guilt?
Alas, yes.
Well, Mr. J, was it? I'm afraid the afterlife doesn't leave me much room for such guilt. So if you'll excuse me, I've heard it all before.
The joy and peace of a clear conscience. I can only hope for such freedom. Yet it is impossible to live life without regrets. Mine are manifold. Even though I have what most would consider a good life, I am haunted by the possibility that my efforts and the efforts of my entire family were in vain. As you've heard, my name is William J., son of the famous founding father John J. And though I had heard of my father's struggles during the Revolution, I had missed all of that, being born in 1789. We grew up in a life of splendor and privilege, yet not of contentment. My father was a devout and restless man. While my mother taught us levity, father taught us faith and responsibility for our fellow. And he taught us a restlessness with the status quo. For example, instead of sending me to his alma mater of Columbia for college, he sent me to Yale for its religious rigor. And I embraced the faith of my church to the extent that my own household, years later of course, paused 3 times a day so that way we may come together for prayer. Along with my faith, Father taught us to seek justice for all men. He meant it. Nevertheless, he was a living contradiction. He was a founding member of the Manumission Society, a group dedicated to the eventual end of slavery in our state and in our country. But at the same time, he bought slaves. Often. His scheme was to purchase them and have them work for a number of years in order to earn their freedom. To pay back an investment, you see. Now, I loved my father, and I did defend him in many of my later writings. But I knew in my heart and in my mind my faith to rebel against all manner of slavery. And so, even in my teenage years, I became an advocate for immediate abolition. No man, woman, or child should have to work without freedom for any amount of time. As I've said more than once, if slavery be inherently and necessarily sinful, it ought instantly to cease. Now, I who had so much felt it my God-commanded duty to protect the weak from the power of the strong, and to shield the poor from the oppression of the rich. And so, I gave up my desire of becoming a farmer in order to pursue law, where I could better serve. This, unfortunately, gave me the label of a radical, or a rabble-rouser, even an attention seeker. True, I did write copious letters and articles, and even books condemning slavery and the wishy-washy stance of that Manumission Society and their push for very gradual manumission. And I vehemently attacked the Colonization Society, who sought to free slaves only on the condition that they be sent away to Liberia in order to remove all people of color from America. Needless to say, I was not invited to many parties. What's more, many were the article published to attack me and my efforts.
9/10 of the horrors of slavery are imaginary. Your efforts are unconstitutional. Your emancipationists are reckless subsidiaries seeking to dissolve the Union. Your efforts are unconstitutional.
I was eventually removed from my judgeship in Westchester County because I was deemed too political. Even my own church rejected resolutions that I had brought forth at diocesan conventions in order to end its support of slavery. I considered leaving, as did many other abolition-minded society men. But after a conversation with my friend and fellow Episcopalian, Congressman Salmon P. Chase, it occurred to me that I must stay. Salmon, I said, let us rather remain there in our church and strive valiantly for the truth, giving our bishops and our clergy no peace while they side with the oppressor. Let us proclaim the wrongs of the slave and the duties of the church. So I remained. I raised my children to be good Episcopalians. And I do take some pride in my son John, who became a bit of a rabble-rouser himself. It was he who finally had St. Philip's admitted to the convention of the Diocese of New York. And yet for all my work, I did not bring about the immediate end of slavery in New York. did not stop the acts of the Colonization Society. I didn't stop the atrocious acts of selling enslaved people to plantations in the South, or the kidnapping of free black people and dragging them into slavery. Worst of all, I was unable to convince my fellow Episcopalians that all of God's children deserve to be treated with the dignity and respect of brothers and sisters. But for all that, I was blessed. I had a loving family, a sense of purpose, and wealth enough to pursue it. And, of course, unlike so many, I had the good fortune of being born a white man in America. Perhaps one of my most lasting and personal lessons occurred after I died. My friend Frederick Douglass gave a eulogy for me. It was 25 pages long. But what touched my heart was the conclusion. In it, he said, "He has taught us how to live, and he has taught us how to die." Still, how could I but regret that I could not do more? I pray regularly that I'm forgiven my failings.
You have many regrets, my friend.
James Brown, once known as Anthony Chase, formerly enslaved, master gardener, registered voter.
Yes, regrets. I've had a few.
Well, my life never did without any regrets. Not as an enslaved man or free.
I'm glad you were given your freedom.
Oh, I wasn't given my freedom. I took it.
Oh?
Perhaps you should take your freedom too, my friend.
Oh, pray tell more. I lend you a willing ear.
Let me tell you about it. I was born into slavery. I made my way and paid my way into a better life. I worked hard, studied hard, and saved hard. In the end, I became a respectable member of society. That's how it's supposed to be, right? But to a lot of folks, I was just no good runaway. It's true. I was a runaway. My name is James Brown, though I once went by the name of Anthony Chase and sometimes Anthony Fisher. Names for a slave were flexible. Anyway, my name is Anthony, and I was born on October 1st, 1793 to the Williams family. The man who laid claim to my life was Mr. Henry Lee Williams. Not a bad man, I suppose. When I was 25 years old, he gave me what you might call quasi-freedom. That's where I got to live my own, earn some wages, pay taxes, but he hired me out to folks too. And all that time, I'm saving money, thinking about the day I can buy my freedom. Then one day, Mr. Williams fell sick. And as he lay there dying, he writes me a note saying how he wants me to have my freedom when he died. On that promise, I took some of my money and married my Julie. She was a slave too, but a free man will buy his wife's freedom. Only a man has to be free first. When Mr. Williams died, his sister Susan decided she no longer wants to let me go. Should have known better. White promises weren't all that dependent. I tried to reason with her. I tried to buy my freedom. She wouldn't have it. So I wrote her a letter explaining why I could no longer remain a slave. And this is what I said. This is a step that I never had the most distant idea of taking. But what is a man to do whose hands are bound and feet are fed? He's certainly going to try to loosen them by fair and honorable means. And if not so, loosen them by any means he may think the most advisable. Now, I don't mean to take this step because I wish to be free. I take this step because I wish to do justice to myself and to others. Then, I ran for it. That was 1826, ran to New York City, huh? And not because it was all that welcoming to slaves. It wasn't. And not because blacks were safe there. Bounty hunters were everywhere looking for runaways, and they weren't too particular who they caught and dragged down south, even freeborn blacks.
there were so many Africans there that he could blend in, and that's what I did. Found work too, almost right away. Family named Verplank hired me as their gardener. One day, the Verplanks had company from down south, and they recognized me. They demanded that I be taken back to Maryland and given back to Miss Susan Williams. Naturally, I was petrified. But Mr. Verplank said he had grown fond of me, and he won't allow them to take me away. And he offered to pay Miss Williams whatever she thought I was worth. And this time, she agreed. I was a free man, truly, legally free. Only I had a wife who was still in slavery. So a year later, I traveled to Frederick and bought Julia's freedom for $100. About this time, the Verplanks hired me as their full-time gardener at their home in Beacon. I was that good. I read books on it, corresponded with famous horticulturists, attended meetings, and I made good money. People began to see me as an artist. Even the famous white gardeners started asking me for advice. I became the rarest of black men. I became a middle-class landowner. But what set me apart was that I kept the journey. Sure, it was mostly about the weather and planting techniques, but I also thought about bringing Julia up to New York, and about going to church, all sorts of churches. The Reformed and Episcopal churches were my favorite, even though they weren't all that welcoming to a black man. But I was middle class. That does make a difference. Then, on November 8th, 1837, I wrote this. I, James F. Brown, voted for the first time. Like I said, in a way, I lived the American dream. But it's a sad dream when it starts out in a nightmare. When your proudest moment is gaining the right to do what every white man takes for granted. And it's a sad dream when you have to worry, even as a free and respectable member of society, that on any given day, some bounty hunter can snatch you and drag you away back into slavery. Now I lived long enough to see the Civil War and the promise of freedom it brought. And it saddens me to know that freedom is still as much an illusion today for people of color as it was for me. And so I keep dreaming.
Dream on, my brother.
Oh, I'm dreaming. So good to see you again, Father. You may not remember me for attending the church services.
Oh, I remember with gratitude, and it is right to dream, but both you and I know we have not yet reached that promised land. Not yet.
Reach it, Father.
Not yet. Now, unlike many here, I was never enslaved. Even though I was born in 1786, I was always free. That's not to say that I wasn't affected by the scourge of slavery. Everybody was. And as a man of African descent, well, it shaped everything that I did. Now, my father, he was a Revolutionary War veteran, which makes me a son of the American Revolution. How many of you can say that? Now, he fought for the freedom of this country, even though this country never quite accepted him or any of our people. Now, my mother, well, she was an indentured servant, which is a sort of temporary slave. Now, as a young child in New York City, I attended the African Free School. White schools wouldn't have us, you see. So after that, I started attending private lessons under the tutelage of the Reverend Thomas Lyle. Now, Reverend Lyle, even though he was an Episcopal priest, my father, back in 1796, helped form the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which was only the second all-black denomination at the time. As for me, well, I became more and more involved in the Episcopal Church, starting attending services at Trinity Church on Wall Street. I become such a leader amongst the black Episcopalians that they asked me in 1808 to give a speech commemorating the first anniversary for the abolition of the international slave trade. Now, there was still slavery, and you still could be traded, but it was a first step, a good first step. And my speech made it clear that it was only a first step. Now, that was my introduction into the world of preaching, though it would take another 10 years before Reverend Lyle would help form a congregation for the African Americans. The Free African Church of St. Philip was its name. We had to use white priests for the first few years, though the bishop did allow me to study under a priest and eventually become ordained a deacon. It took another 8 years, in 1826, before I finally be ordained as a priest. I was only the second black Episcopal priest at the time. Even so, the diocese wouldn't allow me to attend convention, and St. Philip's wasn't allowed to send a delegation. We had a church, yet we weren't allowed to become a full part of the wider church. But let me tell you, we didn't give up. Our parish fought for acceptance and for the end of slavery. Let me tell you, I was quite the troublemaker for the diocese. Right after I became ordained, I helped found Freedom's Journal, which was the first black newspaper. Then I formed a mutual aid society for the Africans called the Phoenix Society. Why, I was even on the board for the American Anti-Slavery Society. And there was trouble all around. Back in 1834, riots raged through the city with white folk rampaging through African businesses, homes, and churches. Why, they even ransacked St. Philip one terrifying night. Worse yet, when I went to report the incident to Bishop Underdog, do you know how he replied?
You are to resign at once your connection in every department with the Anti-Slavery Society and to make your resignation public. Let it be seen that whichsoever side right may be, St. Philip's Church will be found on the Christian side of meekness, order, and self-sacrifice to common good and the peace of the community.
Now, there were fights to be had all around. I spent a great deal of my time fighting back against the colonizationists. Now, the colonizationists, they were a group that dreamt up this plan to gather up all the Africans in the country, free and slave alike, and ship us all back to Africa, to a country they created called Liberia. Now, some of them claimed that they cared about us, knew we couldn't get a fair shake here, and thought we can go back there and civilize the natives. But what they really wanted was to get rid of us, all of us. I fought them tooth and nail. Now, as you might expect, all this fighting took its toll. Though my wife, Sarah, supported my work, my body just couldn't take the constant strain. And so, in 1840, at the age of just 54, I died. Oh, let me tell you, my funeral was quite the affair. Most of the clergymen from the diocese was there, and the bishop himself officiated. That was the most attention I ever received from my colleagues. I assumed they thought they were putting to rest the agitation of freedom and justice. They should know that killing one man cannot stop the will of God. And it is the will of God that justice prevail, that the love of God be what we see in each other, that equality is more than just a slogan. Guide my feet while I run this race. Oh, guide my feet while I run this race. Oh, guide my feet while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my race. Oh, hold my hand while I run this race, 'cause I don't want to run this race in vain.
Remember, O Lord, what has fallen us. Look and see our with the yoke on our necks, we are hard driven, we are weary, we are given no rest.
But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations.
Why have you forgotten us, O King? Why have you forsaken us, King?
Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure.
Oh, guide my feet while I run this race, 'cause I don't want to run this race in vain. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain.
I can be like Harriet Tubman running, but I'm not running. I'm creating, not escaping. She gave me that option years ago with her sacrifice, so I may grow up and walk on water like Christ, 'cause he was so dope and nice. Displaying outstanding possibilities everywhere. Tapped me on the shoulder, pointed me to the stars, and said, there are the stairs. With faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains, build igloos on deserts, turn raindrops into beads of gold, and create the greatest stories that'll ever be told. I'm a descendant of the keenest mathematicians. Did you not know that? Recognize. They figured the equation and built pyramids from a grain of sand, set atomic transmitter, sending me messages through the rhythm of the beat of the drum, telling my heart. The drum beats a rhythm that tells my heart. The drum beats a rhythm that tells my heart. The drum beats a rhythm that tells my heart. Play that drum. The drum beats the rhythm that tells my heart. The drum beats the rhythm that tells my heart. The drum beats the rhythm that tells my heart. Drum beats a rhythm that tells our hearts.
We can!